Hey, what's up everybody? My name is Crypt13, and in today's video, I'm gonna be doing comparisons for the Freedom Sworn Sword versus his other weapons with Elemental Mastery main stat, since this weapon also gives Elemental Mastery as its main stat. Freedom Sworn is a weapon best suited for a sub DPS slash swirl support role, so that's what I'll be focusing on here. Now, just because I say that this is a sub DPS or support role doesn't mean that this build doesn't do a lot of damage. In fact, this build does a ton of swirl damage. I'm calling it a sub DPS or support role just because you aren't going to be having Kazuha on the field as much as you would like. You're going to be having another character acting as the main on-field character. The passive ability from this weapon is also a universal team buff, so it pairs perfectly for a sub DPS off-field Kazuha build. Again, don't get triggered just because I'm using the word support. I'll be comparing this weapon with the Iron Sting and the Alley Flash while using a 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set, and then I'll be comparing two different kinds of builds: full Elemental Mastery and no Elemental Mastery, so just a classic attack, Anemo damage, and crit percent build. And of course, I'm going to be running level 80 with talent level 8 scaling and plus 20 4-piece Viridescent Venerer artifacts. Also included are a moderate amount of substats, 3 rolls into attack percent and crit damage percent, giving us 17.4% attack percent and 23.4% crit damage. Alright, so let's jump into the calculations. First off is the no Elemental Mastery comparisons, and we are going to be taking a look at crit, since without Elemental Mastery, we are going to be running Crit Rate Circlet. This gives us pretty decent crit to be able to actually hit crit hits. The Freedom Sworn Sword with no sigils does slightly worse damage than an Alley Flash, and slightly better damage than an Iron Sting. With the buff, however, we are doing more damage, which should be a given, and I would hope that that would be the case, since it is a 5-star. Given how easy it is to proc the buff, you're only going to have 8 seconds of downtime where you won't have the buff. The buff lasts 12 seconds, and there's 20 seconds where you can't gain any more sigils. But that timer starts when the sigils are consumed, so the 12 seconds of buff uptime are overlapped with the 20 seconds of downtime, again leaving us with the 8 seconds left without the buff. For this graph, the percent difference between the Freedom Sworn and our best weapon, the Alley Flash, is about 12.5% damage difference. But remember that Kazuha is not just singly instance damage. So here is a more practical graph that plots his burst tick damage 5 times, along with the elemental absorption damage that ticks along with it, and also 14 instances of swirl, as that's a fairly accurate number for C0 Kazuhas who use their E skill and then their burst. So with this graph, our Freedom Sworn Sword takes the lead, and the Iron Sting pushes ahead of the Alley Flash because the swirl damage stacks so much more damage. The difference now is 8.9% damage difference between the Freedom Sworn Sword with no sigils and the Freedom Sworn Sword with the buff active. And between the Iron Sting, it's about 12% damage difference. So if 12 to 8% damage difference doesn't sound like that much to you, please remember that the buff also gets applied to your entire team. So if we're playing sub DPS Kazuha and swap to another character after casting his skills, your active character is going to be hitting much harder than if you didn't have this weapon. And we're using, say, the Iron Sting or the Alley Flash instead. Now let's go ahead and move on to the full Elemental Mastery builds. First, taking a look at non-crit, since with a full Elemental Mastery build, your crit is going to be pretty low unless you are super lucky with your substats. I will, however, be showing you a graph where we actually do hit crits for those of you guys out there that are lucky enough to get good crit stats from your artifact substats. So please just sit tight for that one. The story here, though, is exactly the same. Freedom Sworn with buffs beats the rest, and Alley Flash slightly takes the cake over Freedom without any sigils and Iron Sting, but again, only with singly instance damage. Moving over to a practical graph, however, the Freedom Sworn Sword takes over, and the Iron Sting follows closely behind. The damage difference here is a minimum of only 4.7% between the Freedom Sworn Sword with buffs and without it. Against the Iron Sting, it's about 6%. Next up is the full Elemental Mastery comparisons when we hit crit hits. This graph is for those of you guys who are lucky enough to get some insane crit rate from your artifact substats to actually be able to hit those crit hits. I'm thinking you should have at least 50%. So if that's you, well, I hate you. Anyway, the story again here is exactly the same, so I'm not going to repeat it. Let's immediately move over to the practical graph. All of the weapons are very close to each other, and the Freedom Sworn with sigils active compared to without the buff active is about 6.8% damage difference. Versus the Alley Flash, it's 8.3, versus the Iron Sting, it's 7.6. Overall, less than 10% damage difference if you can hit crits. Keep in mind that our crit damage is not very high either, because I'm only using 3 rolls of 7.8% crit damage. So if you plan to use this weapon just for Kazuha, and you're not going to take advantage of its ability to buff your teammates, it's not looking too great, because compared to the Alley Flash and Iron Sting, there is overall less than 10% damage difference. But before we get into that, the next question becomes, should we build for classic DPS or a full elemental mastery build with the Freedom Sworn Sword? So if we compare the Freedom Sworn Sword with sigils active between the classic DPS build with crit and a full elemental mastery build with no crits, the numbers we're comparing is 109,366 versus 92,135. That's about a 17% damage difference in favor of a classic DPS build. However, no way will you be able to be hitting crits every time you cast your E skill and burst. So let's look at an average damage, assuming 50% crit rate, so you hit your crits half the time. The comparison then becomes 90,963 versus 92,135. The full elemental mastery, no crit build actually does slightly more damage. But don't take this as the full elemental mastery build is better, but rather see it as they perform very similar or practically almost the same. So build him based on what artifacts that you have, and don't pull your hair out farming for one style over the other. However, I should mention that if you build him for DPS, you won't be boosting your teammates' elemental damage, so please do consider that. Full DPS builds without any elemental mastery substats will give around 11.4% damage bonus to the team, and the full elemental mastery build is going to give 33.84%. These charts also include normal and charged attack damage, and as a sub DPS Kazuha, you are very likely to not use that part of his kit, so it makes the full elemental mastery builds a little bit better in that regard. If a non-crit full elemental mastery build can compete damage-wise with the classic DPS build, then of course if you can hit crits with your full elemental mastery build, that's going to be the best choice. So at the end of the day, that's definitely the absolute goal if you are really trying to min-max your Kazuha. So what is the conclusion here? Do I think it's good? Do I think the Freedom Sworn Sword is worth it? Well, if we are just looking at this from Kazuha's perspective, then no, I don't think this weapon is worth pulling for, because its damage output is very similar to his other free options. So I think that this weapon is not a good weapon to be used just for a solo Kazuha. Absolutely not. But this weapon is more than just the extra damage and attack percent from triggering an elemental reaction for the wielder. It's flexible since its bonuses apply to the whole party. There aren't very many weapons out there right now that possess this ability, and that is designed specifically so that the party can benefit from it. A couple of other weapons that give bonuses to the party are the Wolf's Gravestone and the Song of Broken Wallets. Now, although they do buff the party, these weapons are mainly used for main DPS characters that utilize the buff themselves. Diluc, Eula, and Razor, for example. You typically don't swap off of these characters. You keep them on the field so that they can do the damage. But of course, when you have off-field damaging characters like Xingqiu, they also get the buff, so it kind of works in that regard. But the Freedom Sworn Sword is designed specifically so that it can benefit whoever you want in the party. But this weapon is designed specifically so that it can benefit whoever you want in the party, since you can gain the buff even when the character that holds wants this weapon is off the field. The ability to do that makes this weapon a very strong weapon to boost the whole team's damage output, and being able to stack with other damage boosting passives like Noblesse 4-piece or Millilith 4-piece. But again, do I think it's worth spending your money on? No, but that's because I don't really ever support spending large amounts of money on gacha games, because the monetization style is incredibly predatory and is pretty much gambling. So I do not condone that at all. But if you've been saving everything for Kazuha and want a complete set for him, this weapon is a very solid choice because of its ability to easily boost the entire team's damage. Anyway, that's all that I have for you guys in this video today. Thank you so much if you made it this far in the video, and like always, like the video, and if you really like the content, then consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, I will see you guys later.